welcome to Mimamsa Foundation for Indic Studies first Justice Ranade Memorial Lecture. Mimamsa Foundation so far has engaged itself in activities that would help understand India in a better way. Our focus so far has been in publishing well-researched articles, having special article series, conducting interviews with eminent people, a podcast, so on and so forth. And our endeavor was to sort of contribute to a well-informed debate, discourse, and research about India in a way which is rooted in Indic value systems. Now, in order to sort of expand our activities, we are very happy to announce that we will be each year now organizing Justice Ranade Memorial Lecture, in which we will be calling eminent persons on issues which are pertinent to Indian realities, Indian issues, and deliberate with them on matters of significance. And we are very fortunate to have Advocate Shri Vikramjit Banerjee for the inaugural Justice Ranade Memorial Lecture. Now, Advocate Banerjee is currently Additional Solicitor General of India. He previously served as Advocate General of State of Nagaland and was also Standing Counsel for the Department of Telecommunications, Union of India. He is member faculty at the National University of Juridical Sciences in Kolkata, is a lecturer at IIM Kolkata, and also in various other institutes. He was a recipient of prestigious Chevening Scholarship for the year 1999-2000, which was awarded by British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He has also participated in various international and national conferences, has published research papers, articles in journals and publications of international repute. And today's topic, on which he's going to talk is right to dissent in the Indian Constitution, some thoughts and ideas. So democracy is, as we all know, is defined by the rights it gives to its citizens and the freedoms the citizens enjoy. Similarly, right to dissent and protest is guaranteed by the Indian Constitution. So while this right is guaranteed and it has been upheld in the Indian democracy so far, it is also been seen that this right is often misused for various reasons, for political purposes, so on and so forth. So how do we best understand this right to dissent? What were the debates that were generated when such a provision was made in the Indian Constitution? Equally as important is to what are our duties when we actually enjoy those rights. These are some of the key issues that Advocate Banerjee would be addressing to, and we are very fortunate to have him talk about this. Thank you, Advocate Banerjee, for joining with us. It was really nice of you, and we are very happy that you accepted our invitation.
Thank you, Akshay, being very kind to invite me, and it's an honor to be able to speak at this the first Justice Ranade Memorial Oration, and that's how I would sort of term it. I know it's a great honor, and I know the eminence of Justice Ranade, and so it's for me to be invited to speak in his memory is a great honor. That being said, I think I will now progress on to the small sort of sketchy talk which I intend to talk on in the right to dissent in Indian constitutional law. My views, as I discussed right in the beginning when sort of Akshay broached this subject to me, is extremely nuanced. I am a person who believes that the right to dissent is a very old and sacred right. It is a right on which societies are built. It has been considered by very many, including Indian culture, and I'll take you through that, as considered a right which goes to the very root of what it means to be a viable society. And we've seen it all across the world. This is not something which is new. All of us who know Greek thought, and give you a perspective of how it arises in the ancient world, and I'll take you through Indian, how it arises in Indian thought as well. In Greek thought, the most famous of all dissenters was Socrates, who questioned the power of the state, the power of democracy, the power of taking decisions, the rationality of taking decisions. And he was then forced to drink poison and basically commit ritual suicide. In Roman law, in ancient Rome, and anyone who knows the ancient Roman history will know that the exact founding of the Roman Republic was because of dissent. The Romans actually drove out their first kings before they established the Republic. I think the last king was Tarquin the Proud, Tarquinius Superbus. The Romans drove them out of, and in fact, one of the creators of Rome, the creators of the Roman Republic, of the Roman Empire, Julius Caesar, was actually murdered in the Senate by political dissenters who were afraid that he was becoming a dictator. And a dictator, and not in the shorthand way we know it, but actually in the Roman term, which had a history of such posts being created, who would be rulers, temporary rulers over a period of time, having complete power, and then retiring. And he was actually murdered. He was possibly the most impactful person in the entire history of Rome. And he was murdered in the Roman Senate. Now, in the entire late Roman Republic, and it's interesting to note, in the entire history of the late Roman Republic, we see a continuous battle between two groups of people: the optimates, or who were the conservatives, people who were institutionalists of Rome, and the populares, or those people who wanted change. And of course, then it all ended up with the death of Julius Caesar, who represented the populares, who came into power finally, and that's where it ended, because as we all know, after Julius Caesar, his nephew Augustus Caesar inherits the empire, and Rome becomes an empire. But throughout the history of Rome, there have been large, especially in a Roman Republic, Roman Democratic Republic, there has been a large number of attempts to dissent from institutionalism of Rome. In the olden days, democracy was a messy thing. Democracy was not easy. People got killed. Anyone, the Gracchi brothers were two people, popularis from Popularis group, who went on to succeed and become consuls, and they were murdered. Both of them were actually murdered in the Roman Senate. So, the murder of Julius Caesar had antecedents in history in Rome. So that was a huge history which was always there. And we have to recognize that these murders which happened in Rome, maybe may have been motivated actually personally, but they were always couched on grounds of political dissent. Now coming to Indian law, and that's an interesting aspect, and this is something which we must not forget. In Indian law, we have never thought that, we never had a conception that the king could do no wrong. We've always believed that the leader or the ruler or the Chakravarti, or Rajan, as we used to call in Sanskrit thought, or in Sanskrit literature, in Dharmic thought, was subject to Dharma. And Dharma is the king of kings. And just as it was your Dharma to obey the king, and it was the king's Raj Dharma to ensure that the order was maintained. And if an order was maintained and there was no Matsya Nyaya, I don't know, I'm sure you know the shorthand of what Matsya Nyaya means. Basically, anarchy, rule of fishes, where the big fish eat the small fish. And if the king failed in his duty to protect Dharma, then it was considered the Dharma of the people to depose the king. And there is that famous writing, which I'm sure we've all heard, and very controversially, which says that the king who cannot protect Dharma should be considered a mad dog, and executed. And it was, but on the other hand, we should also, along with this, and this is something which we should, because sometimes only one portion is portrayed as if that is the view of Indian law, but that's not it. On the other was also balanced by the fact that Indian law also considered the obligation of a subject or a part of a person in the kingdom to obey the king. That was his dharma as well. In fact, Indian law also treated Danda as God, as a god, because it believed that the king who represented dharma on earth used punishment as a method to get people back on the path of dharma. Now, this conception of maintaining the balance is essential to the conception of dissent. Just as it is a sacred obligation of a person, of a citizen in a state, it would be my endeavor to show, to protest against injustice, to protest against a king who has strayed from dharma, rulers who have strayed from dharma. It is also the obligation of a person who is a member of a society, member of the state, to follow the king and to follow when the king directs or follows the path of dharma. Now we all know that in India especially, we have never treated kings as beyond reproach. In Europe, as I give you a background, in Europe as well, historically, that was to the case. Whether it be in Greek thought, whether that be in Roman ideas. And these are ancient conceptions of governance which predated the coming of, the want of a better word, Abrahamic religious thought into social and political governance. The concept of king being a representative of God and therefore being beyond reproach is a product, and which we see quite apparently first appears in Roman thought, because it is the Roman Empire during Constantine which first becomes Christian, and the old thoughts or the old jurisprudence is completely banished. And then after 300 years after Constantine becomes the emperor of Rome, and Rome becomes a Christian country and Christian empire, then that also has its knock-on effect on the Arab world, which was very closely tied to the eastern part of Roman Empire. So there was, as we now know, a huge interplay between Rome and Arabia. In fact, Rome controlled large parts of Arabia before the coming of Islam. So a lot of Islamic thought is also, especially as to governance, especially as to position of law, especially as to dissent, has been influenced by Christian law. But even in Islamic law, we have seen the position of the Kharajites, who sort of rebelled against any form of institutional authority, and who believed that dissent is an extremely important part of the interpretation of Islam. But then again, you have to realize there has been, even in the interpretation of Islam, there has been a huge layer of pre-Islamic ideas which are percolated into Islam, so it cannot be taken in a vacuum. But nonetheless, the consensus has always been this, that no doubt everybody has a right to dissent against unjust laws, but it is always balanced by a right to obey just laws, to also obey the king when he is on the path of a righteous path. You can call it deen in Islam, you can call it Dharma in Indic law, you can call it uh, uh, constitutional morality or constitutionalism in today's constitutional lexicon. But you have to do that. Now, again, historically, for 1,000 years, basically the king could do no wrong. But then it first got challenged, and this is important that we notice this. It first got challenged by John Locke. John Locke, in the second treatise of government, basically for the first time challenged it, the divine right of kings. And it's very important to note that the challenge actually came from England. And it's very interesting, at least it's my view, the reason why it arose in England, because England, because of its very peculiar history, and I don't want to go into it in detail, was a country which was the most removed juristically and in a constitutional manner, in a sort of a society and governance model than the Roman Christian model which existed in Europe. So it existed completely independently. It existed almost in a sense of governance, independent of the ideas which came with Roman Christianity. It of course, because it became Christian, even though people converted to the religion, they retained their old ideas of being, which they inherited from being Angles and Saxons, basically the old pre-Christian, and they're very apparent. If you look at the reference to the conceptions of parliament, if you talk about conceptions of king being answerable and all that in English common law, you will see that all predates Christianity, and that's its reference points. So ironically, because of this, it arose in England, because in England people believed that you have a right to dissent if the king strays from the path of justice. And that's actually what Locke said. Now, this idea was then taken over by the French for the French Revolution, and marvelously, I think, in brilliant English, articulated by the American Revolution. The American Revolution, the sort of Declaration of Independence, and then the formation of the Constitution and the First Amendments brought in these conceptions, which they said, we find these truths to be self-evident. But they were self-evident because they came from a certain point of view. And if you look at the formation of the first the Declaration of Independence, and you look at the First Amendment rights as fundamental rights when they were brought up into the American Constitution, you will see that there was a clear attempt to balance these two rights: a right of governance, the obligation of the state to govern, and which had to be balanced by individual rights, the right of a person to dissent. How do you sort of put that into words? How do you locate it? These were questions which arose at that point of time, and the American Constitution attempted to put that into pen and paper. That's its greatest contribution to the world. Now, from there, it comes to India. In India, as I said, dissent against the king is not a new idea. We've always had that. We fought with that. Unjust kings have always in India people have actually stood up against unjust kings. Greatest of great empires have just disappeared like a wisp of smoke, because when people have found them to be unjust. And I always give the example of the Mughal Empire, which existed for literally 150 years. And then after Aurangzeb, when people of the country were convinced that the system was unjust and the king was unjust, it's overnight, the entire kingdom just collapses upon itself. And similarly with the British, I think British Empire lasted for a very long period of time. And when people came to realize that, people may have been sympathetic to the British when they first came, and anyone who tells haven't read contemporary stuff which were being written at that point of time when the British came in, they were taken as a modernizing force. They were taken as a force which was going to bring in education. But when the people realized that it was also an extractionary force, when people realized that there was something major wrong and it was unjust, it was not following the path which it was supposed to. So if you see the rhetoric during the independence movement, right at the beginning, it said that you are not behaving like good kings. We owe allegiance to you, but you do not behave like good kings. And then the consensus just disappears. And this is not new. I can take you through hundreds of examples of Indian things, saying that as long as the king follows his constitutional duty, his moral duty to act as a just ruler, everything's fine. You have to give him obedience. But if tomorrow he does not act in terms of that, then we don't owe him any allegiance whatsoever. In Mahatma Gandhi, I personally believe, codified this in his own way. He sort of brought it forward and converted that into an understandable idea which could be implemented in practice as to how it could be done, what were the principles on which dissent could be organized in society. Because Mahatma Gandhi also is a product of the 20th century. Hind Swaraj is written I think 1908 or 1898 or very close thereabout. So he's a product of that time, and he writes it in a way which reflects the fact that for the first time, these various ideas were being converted into legal principles, or principles on which dissent could be acted upon in India. So he acts and does a brilliant job of organizing our freedom struggle. Now, we are successful. We succeed in getting our independence from colonialism. We form a constitution, but interestingly, our constitution is based on the Parliamentary Model of the 1935 Act, which is very, very British. And when we get independence, we realize that there is very little Indian going around in that constitution. Now, the question is why? And that question comes across a number of times as to why this happened, even though there were Indian models which were regularly being circulated, which was available. But one of the reasons why people, members of the Constituent Assembly, opted for this model is because they believed that this sort of governance model would give India order. It would give India a just society. It would give India a modern society. It would give India a representative form of governance. It would possibly, in many ways, as I'm so fond of quoting, it would be a tool in the creation of a new India which does hold allegiance to the past, but is actually a modern state. As I would say, we formed our own, new India in terms of what Swami Vivekananda said. A nation not in complete thrall of the past, but a nation which takes inspiration from the past to create a new identity, new path for itself. But the biggest problem which we faced at the time of formation of the Constitution, and which Baba Saheb Ambedkar very interestingly flag marked right at the time of the formation of the Constitution, he said, what happens? You people are so used to dissenting, to organizing these marches and continuously dissenting from laws. What do you do now? because our colonial movement, anti-colonial movement, was completely based on dissent. We taught the entire world how to bring down empires through civil disobedience. That is why Mahatma Gandhi is an icon all over the world, because he sort of ensured and categorized it and made it principle based so that it could happen all over the world. So Baba Sahib Ambedkar said very interesting things. So now that you have to give up the grammar of anarchy and you have to go back into using constitutional means to protest, to show your dissent, because we assume that in democracy or in any sort of governance, the government need not always be right. And so therefore, the Constitution then encapsulated it. Of course, it gave you in the preamble the freedoms of the Constitution, which it mentioned in the preamble. But then in the Constitution, it gave you basically Article 19, 1A, the right to freedom of speech and expression, and B is right to assemble peacefully without arms. But interestingly, and this is uniquely different, I don't think that exists in any parallel, any other constitution of the world. It made it subjected to a large number of things. I don't think there is any other constitution before the Indian Constitution which gave restricted fundamental rights. I think Indian Constitution is the first constitution which gave restricted fundamental rights, because previously, if you look at the US Constitution, it gave absolute rights. You look at rights of man, it gave absolute rights. That's what it was framed under. But in Indian constitutional law, because of our history of where we know that our society has always believed in a balance of dissent and obedience to just laws, is therefore we decided that your right should be, you don't have an absolute right. It has to be restricted. So it restricted on grounds of sovereignty, integrity of the state, security of the state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency, morality, contempt of court, defamation, incitement to an offense. That's a very large scope. The reason why you did that is because you wanted to precisely come to a balance. But as we all know, that all of these things were not included right in the beginning, and that was the First Amendment of the Constitution. And all of us who read Tripur Daman Singh's famous Those 16 Days, I think 16 Stormy Days, I think that was 16 Stormy Days, that was what was his book. And when he incredibly highlights the debate of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru with Shyama Prasad Mukherjee in relation to those amendments, and how those amendments were literally in some ways really pushed through against great opposition. And today what we sort of talk about dictatorial authoritarianism, we see that completely as to what happened. In fact, very famously, people were very skeptical of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's approach towards being a liberal. There were very strong words used. I don't want to go into that because that's a scope of another subject, another discussion. I don't want to discuss that. But that is how Pandit Nehru at that point of time thought that a balance could be struck. And the sort of rhetoric which we today see, which is used against this present government, it's surprising. It is surprising how Pandit Nehru said the same things, in many ways, saying that, it is for progress, it is for, for going ahead, and, people who were protesting were regressive and things of that sort. So, he also said these are for the purpose of development. And I don't think they were completely liberal, including the entire creation of the ninth schedule, taking away acts and putting them in a black box which could not be challenged. I don't think any government would have been able to survive that sort of an attempt on the Constitution today. Well, it happened. Similarly, as in I always again say, it is, there's a very strange streak line through Indian liberalism, and we saw that during the 1970s. We saw emergency, which was actually imposed on the grounds of protecting liberalism, and people were put in jail. All opposition leaders were jailed. Constitution was amended beyond, in many cases, sometimes beyond comprehension. Large amendments were made, and many things happened. It was on the grounds of protecting liberalism. So to me, it sounds very strange that people who talk so much about liberalism and right to dissent today, and I say this all the time, I am sure, given the chance, would be the first person to squash all dissent if they ever get the option to do so. But nonetheless, these things happen. But in both cases, as we saw, especially in the case of emergency, and what happened thereafter, is the people brought down a very strong government. And they used the power of dissent in a movement which was unbelievable. They brought a very powerful government, which in many ways was a successful government, down because they used the power of dissent. Because the people are quite aware, and they know very clearly when a government is righteous and when a government is not so. Now, coming to the Supreme Court, how has the Indian Supreme Court dealt with the concept of dissent? I'll just go through a few cases in very shorthand. In Arundhati Roy's case, which dealt with contempt jurisdiction, the court was of the view that there has to be a balance between freedom of expression and the dignity of the court. So you don't have an unlimited right to dissent. It has to be balanced with the right of institutions to protect themselves. In Prakash Jha, there is, of course, that view, Prakash Jha, in context of the question of Arakshan, we know the controversial movie Arakshan. In Prakash Jha's case, the Supreme Court, of course, highlighted that dissent is important for a society to grow, especially on social issues, because it tends to push social issues which may not be in tune with the majority at that point of time, but which can have an impact on pushing the issue further. In Shreya Singhal, which is, of course, that 66A of the IT Act, the Supreme Court again spoke on dissent and said that, well, very interestingly, and this is something which I would flag you, and I'll come back to that later on, said that inconvenient and offensive voices are important. Especially, it said, in a paragraph which goes on to say, especially liberal voices need to be protected from sections of the community. Now, and I do not know, I'm skeptical of that, because in Indian history, if Indian history is anything to go by, Indian constitutional history is anything to go by, whenever liberals say that they are for dissent, we should take it with bags of salt, because it has always fallen on conservatives and people who are traditionalists and people who have been closer to the people to actually stand up for the right to dissent. I don't want to go because it would sound a political speech, but if I have to narrate the times when people who are considered traditionalists have stood up for the right of the people to stand up against an unjust government, I can assure you there would be much, much more than the liberals ever have. Now, in Devidas Tuljapurkar in 2015, which also spoke about, it was about Mahatma Gandhi's and criticism of Mahatma Gandhi. The Supreme Court said that there is a need to interrogate icons, and criticism should be accepted in the spirit of everybody has feet of clay. But it's in Subramaniam Swamy's case in 2016, which I think is extremely important, because in Subramaniam Swamy, what the court actually says that though dissent has a respected place in the Indian Constitution, however, there is a need to tolerate unpopular voices. However, it cannot be unlimited. It has to be proportionate. And that is why 19, you have the absolute right of 19(1), but it's always subject to 19(2). Again, the same ideas have been articulated in Puttaswamy and the indibly creative. Indibly creative is a very interesting thing to me, because it comes from a Bengali movie called Bhuter Bhovishyat, which is a critique of the present existing government in West Bengal, and the government banned it. It went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court again said that dissent has to be tolerated. So I think that it's extremely important that this balance has to be continuously maintained. But I think more than freedom of speech matters, I think where the Supreme Court has articulated this balance better, and I think that is because it has a direct and clear impact on law and order, is on the right to assemble peacefully without arms matters. In Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangh, which was about the right to protest at Jantar Mantar in 2018, the court said space in democracy for legitimate dissent has to be protected, but has to be balanced so that it doesn't become unlawful. And it's the same view that the court took in Amit Sahni, which was about the Shaheen Bagh protests and the right to block roads. So the court said that there has to be a balancing of rights, and no right is absolute, and you can't block roads. The governance has to be protected. Others' rights have to be looked into. So it cannot be a one-way street or one person's absolute rights. In conclusion, I think we have to be, today we are moving to a space where we have to take the warning of Baba Sahib, really to heart, where he said that you cannot dissent for dissent's sake. You cannot dissent without any objective. And you have to dissent in a constitutional manner. And of course, there is the continuous dilemma which we all face. What do you do with unjust laws? Mahatma Gandhi's Salt March. What do you do when you're torn between your dharma to obey the ruler and your dharma to decide against what is unjust, and to go against, decide against, to dissent against unjust laws? And I think it is here where time and again the Indian population has always shown that it knows in its heart as to which issue matters to it the most, and it has stood up on a number of occasions on grounds of autocratic rule during emergency, on corruption in India, against corruption movement, and on various different issues. And it has always stood up because it realizes in its heart it knows, and it's intangible. And like as they say about dharma is shukshma. It's very difficult, but you know what it is. But what is now happening is, as today's dissent and has become political. It is not issue-based. It is not about whether laws are just. It comes from a group of people who have been displaced from power and who have become disaffected. They are disaffected with the government as dissent for dissent's sake. It is not a constructive dissent, which all democracies require, which is extremely important, but it has become a dissent whereby it is a protest against being displaced from positions of patronage and power, which one has been used for a very long period of time. It is in many ways, as dissent today has become a shorthand excuse of basically protesting dispossession of people from what they considered they inherited positions of privilege in society and the state. And that is what we have to be really afraid of, because this is a recipe in many ways, I think, for complete disaster. And how we deal with these dissenters is something which we have to be very careful of how we deal with it, because in many ways, um, it can become malign rather than benign. And we have seen streaks of that very recently. I don't want to go into recent politics. We've seen streaks of that recently. It can become something which is harmful to society. It can become something which is harmful to the state, to the country, to the people. And that is what we have to be very, very afraid of, because it has created a group of people who are permanently disaffected. And that is a scary thing. And to quote, to end off my sort of small talk, is something which we have to keep in mind. And that's my warning to people who, that's a warning which we should all keep in mind. What Julius Caesar said during the Catiline conspiracy, during the late Roman Republic, when people were parts of the senators were conspiring to overthrow the Roman state. He said a very interesting thing. He said, a nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and carries his banner openly. But the traitor moves amongst those within the gate freely. His sly whispers rustling through all alleys, heard in the very halls of government itself. This is a warning from the late Roman Republic. And it is a warning before everything collapsed in Rome. It is a warning which we should take to heart. Thank you very much. We should all keep in mind. Oh, thank you.
Yes, interesting observations. And thank you for that wonderful and insightful overview on how dissent is to be understood and also dissent is to be contextualized. It was particularly interesting to see how India has also sort of caveated the entire dissent. And if I may sort of interpret it that way, that the Indian contextualization of dissent sort of follows the Dharmic model as to balance the duties and the rights in a way. Interesting. So we actually had certain interesting questions also. So we had opened up this for some of our viewers, and they have interesting questions. So I'll just read one of them. The first, actually, this was coming from Murli Krishna. He's a self-employed. He's actually, if I just sort of summarize, it's a long question, but if I just summarize, he's saying that is it not necessary to, no, this is not essentially with regards to dissent, but this is what he's saying, that is it not necessary to redraft basic constitution regularly after every certain point in time? Today's realities do not reflect the 50s and the 60s, but so is it not necessary to sort of relook at constitution every single time? So probably he's saying that do we need another constituent assembly debate? If I may just
actually the point is taken, and I always say that he's not, that is Murli's question, but
yes,
Murli is not alone. I don't know whether Murli knows that Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Madison in a famous letter where he said constitutions should only be for 20 years because one generation cannot bind the other. And it's a very, very famous extract. So Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Madison exactly on that point. That is why I think the British still don't have a written constitution. So when you will see a British history, constitutional history, they'll say, okay, 1600, these were the constitutional documents. In 1835, these were the constitutional documents. So these constitutional documents would change. Because what was important, like today in today's Britain, the European Charter of Human Rights is an important constitutional document, but it wasn't that 20 years back. And Race Relations Act may have been is an important constitutional document. It may not be 20 years back. So what is a constitutional document is important. Though now I think in Britain they have come up with a law saying that, okay, for judicial review, for the purpose of judicial review, if it's an important constitutional document, then it has to be specifically overruled by Parliament. So Parliament has to mention that, saying that we are overruling it, and then overrule it.
Okay.
But it has, in many ways, as you know, it's a flexible constitution, what we call a flexible constitution. But that's the thinking behind it. And that's why I say, if there is an European, the closest to a non-Roman European legal thinking that we have is common law, because that's another long discussion. And that's why it's been able to be used in various very, very different societies, whether it be in Africa, whether it be in India, whether it be in Malaysia, with great amount of effectiveness, because it goes back to conceptions of law which are not strictly European.
Okay. So
pre-Christian European in many ways.
Just taking a cue from there is something like basic doctrine, sort of being sacrosanct. Does it sort of is a hindrance to a more liberal amending the constitution in a more liberal, not
no,
liberal?
I'm always of the view that I'm skeptical of basic structure. I think when basic structure itself was formulated, people were skeptical of basic structure. Justice Matthew famously said that contents of fundamental rights may change. And people that's why basic structure was kept vague.
Right.
So, I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical. Basic structure is to me, very, very European, Roman, very Roman, Roman European in its orientation, or German in its, because that's where German constitutionalism takes its inspiration from, because in many ways, Romans believed in that sort of a classification of having fundamentals form of governance, while for that matter, common law, which I think has a completely different heritage, believes in law which arises from the people, and a bottom-up legal system. Of course, there is a state, so king does have a voice in it, but nonetheless, the law is bottom-up, while which is akin, which I'm not saying exactly the same, which is akin to the system which we had in India, while the Roman law is a top-down mechanism. So, for whatever that is worth.
Interesting. All right, there is another question from Dr. Vivek Bhave. And again, he's saying that any issue is discussed at length in the parliament, and the parliament is the only place where law is made. And once it is passed in the parliament, the act is passed in the parliament, it in a sense reflects the will of the people. That's what it is. So is it therefore, how dissent can be exercised on that law? If so, then if this is what he's saying, and I'm quoting, if it's so, then every law will be challenged by the crowd under right to dissent. Is it a good symptom for democracy?
Well, I think you have the right. Of course, you have the right. The Constitution gives you the right to challenge any law. That's what judicial review is for, because to see whether it goes against constitutional provisions, whether it's within the power of different people, different institutions which have passed the law. And there are, I would say, constitutional provisions in the Indian Constitution. I've always said this, which is unwritten, which the Parliament does not pass, but it is there. For example, reservation in service. What is the exact proportion of reservation? These are all by government executive orders. And the definition of caste, the definition of which social group falls into which category. These are all constitutional issues which have been decided, but there have been absolutely legal issues which have been decided, not within the purview of Parliament. But the fact of the matter is this, that we, for better or for worse, we have a representative form of governance.
Mhm.
And even if you have a direct form of governance, even if you had a direct form of governance, I think, as the famous example of Socrates is, just because people believe something to be right doesn't mean that it's always right. And in Indian law, we knew that.
Mhm.
So in Indian law, there was majority, but there was law, but law had to be in conformity to Dharma. And if it was not, even however big, however important, whether the Sabha passed it or whether the king passed it, if it conflicted with Dharma to that extent, it would be invalid. So just because a assembly, of course, it has to be given its respect. That's the balance. That's the question of balance, which we all have to strike.
I think I think if I can sort of guess from where the gentleman is actually coming from, it's essentially talking about what the recent happenings were. And if, if I think some of them also, when there is a sort of some majority opinion is sliding towards something, how good the parliament stands with regards to that. I think that's
See,
where.
I, I come from West Bengal, and I'll tell you this, Akshay. If that example were to be imposed on the state assembly, it's not a good idea. So if you are talking about constitutional principles,
Mhm.
it has to be applied across the board. And what is sauce for the goose will eventually be sauce for the gander. So I have to be very, very careful. Um, but I assume that balance has to be maintained.
Yes, there is another question from Sandesh. He's actually talking about, again, in a different context, not uh, essentially about dissent, but he's saying that uh, right now there is a sort of fine line between hate speech and free speech. And how do you sort of, what have been the Supreme, if you sort of look at.
So there is a long line of judgments on that. I'm sure all of us are aware. I don't want to go into that. That's the scope of a completely different other talk, maybe, which you can invite someone to speak on hate speech and free speech and where does one end. But I have always believed exactly what we were discussing, and that's what it's the Indian Constitution never gave. Unlike the American Constitution, it clearly gave a balanced right. And the reason why it gave a balanced right is because of the fact of our cultural background to it. I always find a very interesting observation in Chanakya, where Chanakya says, what speech is the best? He said the best speech is even if you're saying unpalatable truths, but it should be said sweetly. I think that's incredible observation. So, how you say it, you have to say the truth. So we have always believed that this balance has to be maintained.
Right. I think this is the last question that we have taken up for it. The person has not mentioned the name, but the question is about, I think this is coming from the recent statement by, I think, Arundhati Roy, that we should have a fixed term for any political leader or a prime minister. So do you think it's a very good idea to sort of restrict the term for the political office? Constitutionally, is it possible? And also, is it a good idea to lessen the term from 5 years to, let's say, 3 years or 4 years? Is that any discussion? That's what the question is.
No, I don't know. Actually, will you just sort of reframe it? I
Yeah.
didn't get
So I
what.
think the person is asking, is it a good idea to lessen the tenure of, let's say, prime minister from 5 to 3, and also
I
restrict the number of times that person can come into the power?
See, in India, we never had that problem. I think we people know. And first of all, I don't think there should be a short tenure. 5 years is good enough. Shorter than that would, anyway, this is all political. Anyway, we have elections every 3.5 days in this country, and every year we have one set of elections. So people are continuously actually campaigning. So you don't have time for policy framing. That's why the prime minister said there should be one nation, one election. So you have time to implement policies, because you can't implement policy because obviously when you implement a policy within 2 years, you're going to have people who are disaffected. And if you're going to have election after 3 years, every 3 years, so no policy will ever get implemented, because the benefits only start appearing after 2.5 years, after some point of time. But if you're just going to hammer and implement, immediately have elections, so it's going to be very difficult to have long-term reform. That's one. Two, where the whole question of whether there should be term limits, I don't think so. I think if you look at Indian history, at least Indian political history since independence, there have been very strong rulers, prime ministers, chief ministers, but they've lost. I know from my state there was a government for 35 years, and for whatever reason there was a certain amount of support for them across the board, irrespective of however ruthless they may have been in their governance models. But there was a certain amount of support, and then one fine day they were gone. And today you can't even actually, if you go to Calcutta, you wouldn't even believe that they ever existed as a political party. So it makes you wonder. So I don't think term limits is an answer. And it's never been an answer. I think people in India are too clever. They're very intelligent. And as I said, they know exactly when a government is unrighteous, and they know exactly how to unseat it when they see so.
So there is a societal wisdom, and we must trust that societal wisdom.
So that's an old, actually, I will say there's an old Indian thing. Every society has its own way of keeping this balance. The Chinese have their own way of keeping balance. Europeans have their own ways of keeping balance. The problem with our elites is, and people like us, I don't know about you, I don't know your background, but people like us, is that we have been acculturated to see the world through the lens of Europe. So whatever reference points we have is in many ways is Western and European. So we sometimes, in this way, sometimes we miss reading the actual India, which wasn't the case even, I think, till my father's generation, because people were, even during the time of the British, people were both grounded in the real India as well as in Western education. Post-independence, this has become a major problem, and which has disconnected us. But people who are grounded will know that this is how India has always kept its balance. And greater, more powerful. And for God's sake, people brought down the British Empire in 30 years. They brought it down. The Mughal Empire was gone in 30 years, and British Empire, which ruled the world, it was destroyed in India in a period of basically 30 years. From 1910 to 1947, it was gone.
Interesting, actually. Wonderful. Thank you, sir, for a wonderful talk and engaging with those questions.
Pleasure.
And also thank you, all of you, for joining for this very insightful lecture and the question answers. If you please tell us what you like about this in the comments. Also tell you what you don't like, because that will give us space to sort of improve further. If you enjoy our videos, if you enjoy our works, please subscribe to this YouTube channel for more updates. If you think that whatever work we are doing, kindly support us from whatever way you can. All the information is there in the description. And thank you once again for joining, and thank you, Advocate Banerjee, for your time.
Thank you.